Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today we are undertaking a really critical deep dive into the historical and conceptual roots of our current reality. We're focusing on one of the most challenging, but I think also one of the most essential works of modern political thought.
And that would be Michel Foucault's 1978-1979 lecture series, which was posthumously published as The Birth of Biopolitics.
Exactly. And the core question Foucault helps us tackle here is, well, it's profound. How did the modern world shift its mode of governance from focusing on sovereign rule, the king and his laws, and the coercive control of subjects,
Where I get the top-down power.
to one that governs through economic principles, through the relentless calculation of utility, and the constant active management of individual freedom?
That is precisely the crucial shift. And why this dive matters so much right now is that it reveals the deep, often invisible structures of contemporary governance. It's what most people today would just call neoliberalism.
But he gives us the history, the why. He does. It doesn't just describe policies. It explains why market logic, why efficiency metrics, and these competitive pressures have, well, permeated every single corner of our lives: policy, healthcare, education, even our personal choices today. It shows that these aren't just accidental policy choices. They're actually the necessary logic of the system itself.
And I want to be really clear to everyone listening. Our mission today is not to debate political parties. And we're not making partisan or ideological claims here.
Not at all.
We are explicitly engaging in a systems analysis of what Foucault calls the rationalization of governmental practice. We're looking at the logic, the framework, and the method of how we are governed.
The thinking behind the doing.
Right. And this exploration helps us understand why the system, no matter who is in office, often produces these very predictable outcomes tied to economic efficiency rather than, say, historical traditions or legal rights. We're tracing the historical architecture of power, independent of who's currently holding the blueprints. Okay, so for many of our listeners, the name Michel Foucault is, instantly associated with his other major works. They'll think of Prisons or Madness or Sexuality.
Sure, Discipline and Punish, or The History of Sexuality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for him to step into economic history and political theory, as he does in The Birth of Biopolitics, it might feel like a bit of a departure.
It seems that way, but it's not a departure at all. It's really a necessary continuation of his lifelong project. He described his work as undertaking the history of systems of thought.
And his approach is just fundamentally disruptive to how history is usually analyzed.
It is. He's deeply suspicious of starting from these abstract, big, fixed universals like the state or the subject or the economy. He thinks those are the things you have to explain, not the things you start with.
Okay, let's pause on that, because getting your head around this method is absolutely essential to grasping his argument about modern governance. If he doesn't start with the state, where does he begin?
He begins with concrete, real-world practices. He looks at very specific administrative techniques. How are prisoners actually managed day-to-day? How is public health organized on the ground? How are markets regulated in practice?
So the small things.
The very small, tangible things. And he uses these practices to show how the phenomena we just assume are these fixed universals like society, sovereign, or the state itself were actually formed, how they were constituted and made operational through these nitty-gritty historical practices.
So he's essentially running history backwards. Instead of saying, well, the state existed and therefore it created these laws, he's saying,
look at these specific practices of law, of policing, of administration. Over time, they came together to form the entity that we then retroactively call the state.
Yeah.
He passes those universals through the grid of concrete practices.
And that shows they're contingent, that
Yeah.
they didn't have to be this way.
Exactly. And in this particular set of lectures, he's focusing on the rationality of governing. He's exploring how power shifted from being focused on the explicit control of a territory, a kingdom's borders, to the management of a population.
So these lectures, Naissance de la Biopolitique,
Okay.
they were delivered in 78, 79, and they followed his work on security, territory, and population. How did he set the philosophical stage for this specific analysis?
It's interesting how he did it. He set the tension for the entire course using two seemingly contradictory maxims. The first is very famous, often associated with Freud. It represents the revolutionary urge.
Okay.
I will raise hell. It's that impulse toward constant challenge, radical change, and, upsetting the established order.
And the second one is the counterpoint. I imagine it's less well known.
Much less. It comes from the English statesman Robert Walpole, and it's quieta non mover.
which means...
Let sleeping dogs lie. And this embodies the principle of non-intervention, of caution, and most importantly for Foucault, of self-limitation in the exercise of power.
That's fascinating. So the whole premise of modern government, according to him, is framed around this tension figuring out when and how the government should essentially just let sleeping dogs lie.
It is. The whole goal of the course was to figure out how governmental practice was rationalized to govern in the best possible way, not by maximizing control, which was the old way, but often by refraining from acting. It's a history of governmental self-limitation.
So if we pull all of that together, what is Foucault's central thesis here? What's the big takeaway about this massive historical shift?
The central thesis is that modern government, what we call liberalism, is defined by its self-limitation. But, and this is the key part, this limitation isn't external. It's not imposed by a revolution or a Bill of Rights.
So where does it come from?
These limits are formulated internally by a new kind of knowledge, economic knowledge or political economy. This knowledge starts to act as a regime of truth.
A regime of truth. What does that mean?
It's a framework that dictates what is useful, what is efficient, and therefore what is politically true for a government to do.
So government stops asking, is this legal? Or is this what the king commands?
Right.
And it starts asking.
Is this economically efficient? Exactly. And Foucault says this is the necessary precondition for understanding biopolitics. The politics focused on managing life, health, safety, the productivity of the population, the bio part, that can't function under the old regime of unlimited sovereign power.
Why not?
Because biopolitics requires a liberal governmental rationality. It needs a system that manages dangers through incentives and limited interventions, treating the population as a field of economic interest to be optimized. The economic rationalization is the tool that makes the politics of life both effective and efficient.
Okay. With that foundation laid, let's get into the core mechanisms Foucault identifies. The things that actually drove this shift from, the unlimited power of the police state to the calculated management of interests we see under liberalism.
The first and I think the most foundational shift is all about the nature of constraints placed on power.
Right. The transition from juridical opposition to intrinsic self-limitation. So let's contrast the old world, dominated by what he calls raison d'etat, with the new one.
Okay, so under raison d'etat, the police state operated on a principle of internal control that was, well, it was virtually unlimited. The goal was simple: strengthen the state, maximize its resources, and control its population down to the finest detail.
You mean like regulating what people wore? Or...
Everything.
Yeah.
What they wore, how many children they should have, what crops to plant. The goal was total administrative oversight, and when this state power was challenged, the opposition always came from the outside.
And this opposition was fundamentally juridical. It was about law.
Absolutely. The opponents, whether they were jurists or philosophers of natural law or revolutionaries, they argued against the sovereign on the grounds of illegitimacy. They'd claim the sovereign was usurping fundamental inherent rights or breaking a social contract. The whole battle was fought on the terrain of law and sovereignty.
But under liberalism, that entire framework of opposition just sort of collapses.
It fundamentally changes. Under liberalism, the limitation on government is no longer about some external abstract rights. It's de facto, and it's intrinsic to how the government works.
What does that mean in practice?
It means that if a liberal government ignores these new limits, let's say it imposes sweeping price controls, it's not branded as illegitimate or tyrannical.
It's branded as what?
It's branded as clumsy or ignorant or inadequate. It failed not morally, but intellectually. It failed because it didn't respect the necessary inherent efficiency of the economic order. The critique becomes one of incompetence.
That's a profound paradox. The government that claims to guarantee freedom has to limit its own power. But if it gets that limit wrong, the criticism is about bad management, not tyranny.
Exactly. The limits move from being philosophical rights to being practical, observable consequences. And the mechanism that enforces this new reality, that's where we have to go next.
Which brings us to a concept that completely redefines how we think about the economy. The market as a site of truth, or as he calls it, veridiction.
The market, historically, was just a domain of jurisdiction. It was a place for trade, and the sovereign had the right to regulate it. Under liberalism, it transforms. It becomes a mechanism for verifying or falsifying government practices. It becomes a site of veridiction, a place where a certain kind of truth is spoken.
But how does this spontaneous, often chaotic exchange of goods manage to speak the truth to the massive power of the state? It seems like an unequal conversation.
Foucault uses the 18th century debates around the grain trade as the perfect concrete example. Under the old regime, a monarch's main concern was public order. Grain prices were regulated, often fixed to prevent riots and famine in the cities. The goal was purely political.
But the economists of the time, the physiocrats and early liberals, they challenged this.
They did. They observed that when the government fixed prices or tried to manage the supply of grain, the predictable outcome was hoarding, black markets, and ultimately worse shortages than before.
So the market's reaction proved the policy wrong.
Precisely. The market, through its spontaneous price formation when it was left free, revealed that the government's objective preventing famine was being undermined by the very means it chose, which was price regulation. The resulting scarcity proved the government's action was economically false. It was an action born of ignorance of economic reality.
So the economic knowledge political economy, which was initially formed within the state's goals, to enrich the sovereign,
Mercantilism, right.
it ends up providing the very knowledge that dictates the state's self-limitation. It's like a snake eating its own tail.
It is a stunning feedback loop. The state develops this knowledge to optimize its own power, only for that very knowledge to turn around and tell the state to stop using that power in the old way. And this new knowledge fundamentally changes the whole goal of governance, which brings us to the next big insight.
The economic game shifts from zero-sum to unlimited growth. And here we have to look at the massive intellectual leap between mercantilism and the new liberal economics.
Mercantilism, the economic doctrine of raison d'etat, was defined by a profoundly zero-sum view of wealth. Wealth was equated with hoarding gold. And since the total amount of gold in the world was assumed to be more or less fixed.
If one state gained gold, another one had to have lost it.
Exactly. My gain is your loss. And that zero-sum logic necessitated constant competition and, more importantly, a European balance of power.
You had to stop any one country from getting too strong.
Precisely. If one European power became too wealthy, it would destabilize the whole continent. So competition had to be blocked through diplomacy and war to prevent any single empire from dominating. The market was a battlefield.
But then thinkers like the physiocrats and, of course, Adam Smith, they come along and completely rewrite the rules of the game.
Absolutely. Liberalism posits that the market, based on free exchange and specialization, is a non-zero-sum game. The enrichment of one country or the profit of one merchant isn't achieved at the expense of another. It leads instead to mutual, collective, and unlimited enrichment.
The idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. The global pie is infinitely expandable.
That's the core idea, but that is a staggering change in strategic outlook, and this boundless ambition demands something new from the system.
Which is what?
It fundamentally requires the opening up of the entire world as Europe's permanent and collective marketplace. The dream of unlimited collective enrichment for European powers necessitated a worldwide stage for continuous expansion.
And Foucault highlights that this implies a deep difference in status between Europe and the rest of the world.
A huge difference. Europe becomes the subject of this collective wealth creation, and the rest of the world is reduced to being the market or the resource base. The global ambition is no longer about balancing power. It's about guaranteeing exponential worldwide growth forever.
Which itself creates enormous risks. I mean, how does the liberal state manage a system of infinite growth and perpetual risk?
And that brings us to the final core idea. Liberalism is the management of danger through freedom and security. Because freedom, the engine of all this wealth, is inherently dangerous. It produces volatility, monopolies, economic collapse, poverty, individual accidents.
A whole host of new problems.
A whole host. So the liberal art of government becomes focused almost entirely on managing this perpetual state of danger.
So government is in this constant balancing act. It has to produce freedom, but it also has to mitigate the risks that freedom itself creates. It sounds like a paradoxical tightrope walk.
It is the essence of the paradox. To preserve free trade, you have to intervene with anti-monopoly laws. To sustain a free labor market, you need social assistance programs to manage the poverty and unemployment that free markets inevitably generate. Otherwise, you risk dangerous political ruptures.
So liberalism is constantly implementing what he calls security mechanisms.
Yes, and not to suppress freedom, but to contain the dangers that its own principle of freedom generates.
This sounds far more active than the minimal night watchman state that many people associate with classical liberalism.
It is extremely active, but in a very specific way. It's not about giving commands, it's about framework management. And Foucault connects this directly back to the concept of panopticism.
Or Bentham's panopticon. the prison design.
That's the one. It was initially for prisons and schools, but Bentham himself proposed it as the very formula of liberal government.
How does a prison blueprint become the template for a free society? That seems
That-
counterintuitive.
Because the panopticon is about continuous internalized supervision. In the liberal state, the government's power is limited to this kind of continuous supervision, monitoring prices, tracking populations, analyzing risks. And it only intervenes when things clearly fail to work according to the market's supposed natural mechanics.
So it's a kind of diagnostic power.
Exactly. Panopticism, in this sense, is the mechanism that ensures the market is operating correctly, or that the individual, the Homo economicus, is self-managing effectively. It's about regulating the optimal conditions for competition. Power becomes procedural and diagnostic rather than just saying no.
Okay, let's try to map these philosophical and economic shifts directly onto the political structures now. This is where we can see the systems Foucault is analyzing come into really sharp relief.
Right. So as we established, the old model of raison d'etat and sovereign power was centered on the singular interest of the state. The police state aimed for unlimited internal control, extending its grasp down to the most granular level. Its legitimacy came from history or law.
But the new system, liberalism, as a self-limiting governmental rationality, it completely bypasses that singular state interest.
Absolutely. The new rationality functions exclusively in terms of interests, this complex interplay of individual profit, collective utility, and market equilibrium. The state is no longer this monolithic entity. It becomes, as Foucault calls it, the manager of the phenomenal republic of interests.
And this shifts the fundamental question for any politician or policymaker.
It moves from how do I make the state stronger and wealthier to what is the utility value of government action in a society where exchange determines the true value of things? Government is now forced to constantly ask itself how useful it is.
And this utility principle is where the market's power as a site of truth really takes hold and becomes a practical tool of government.
It is. The market's logic is used to define and delimit the sphere of government's competence, based purely on the utility of governmental intervention. And this was a radical approach that prevailed in the West. It allowed authorities to regulate governance in terms of economic utility, rather than fighting these endless bloody battles over axiomatic original rights, which was the alternative approach from thinkers like Rousseau.
Now we come to what Foucault identifies as the Great Shift, the divergence between classical and neoliberal problems. And this distinction is just vital for understanding governance today.
It's crucial. Classical 18th century liberalism faced the problem of how to carve out space for market freedom within an already powerful established state.
Right, the state was already there.
Exactly. So the answer was to push back, to argue for non-intervention based on the belief that less government meddling in the market would actually yield more state power and wealth in the long run.
But the neoliberal problem, which really emerges after World War II, faced a dramatically different world.
It really did. The neoliberal context, especially in a place like Germany in 1945, was defined by a state that was either defeated, politically debarred because of its historical crimes, or just economically ruined. So the problem flipped on its head.
The question became,
Given a state that effectively doesn't exist or whose legitimacy is completely poisoned, how can we get it to exist by modeling the overall exercise of political power on market principles?
and this leads us right into the heart of German ordoliberalism, the Freiburg School, which explicitly tried to build state legitimacy from economic performance, not from history.
Yes, the ordoliberals, people like Walter Eucken and Wilhelm Röpke, they recognized that in post-war Germany, they couldn't appeal to traditional claims of nationalism or history. Those claims were morally and politically bankrupt. They needed a totally new foundation for the state.
And that foundation became prosperity, the economic miracle.
Yes. They made economic growth and robust market performance the exclusive basis for state legitimacy. Economic freedom was designed to function as a kind of siphon for political consensus. If the economy delivers, the state is legitimate. End of story.
So the economy creates the political signs that people need to feel allegiance.
Absolutely. A strong Deutschmark, continuous growth, high purchasing power, these became the daily, tangible signs of individual adherence to the state. And this system, Foucault argues, establishes a profound reversal of the axis of time.
What do you mean by that?
Economic success provides a permission to forget a malfunctioning history. The state's root, its justification, ceases to be historical or juridical. It becomes radically and exclusively economic. The political is essentially subsumed by the economic.
And this ordoliberal model was centered on a very specific idea, the state modeled on the enterprise. But this wasn't just about privatization, which is often how we think of neoliberalism today.
That's a crucial distinction to make. The order liberal policy of society, or Gesellschaftspolitik, it sought to formalize society itself on the model of the enterprise, not just state-run industries. This meant generalizing the enterprise form down to the very fine grain of the social fabric.
How does it actually manifest in daily life? How do you make a society into an enterprise?
Well, it permeates everything. Private property is understood not as a static right you just have, but as an enterprise that has to be managed and optimized for growth. A family home is an enterprise. Individuals are actively encouraged to become non-proletarian, craft-based enterprises, a small business owner, an independent contractor.
So the ideal is a society of small businesses all competing with each other.
A society of enterprises constantly in competition, demanding framework regulation from the state, but rejecting any kind of targeted intervention.
And this kind of enterprise society would require a specific legal structure to maintain order. Right.
Right, and it leads to what Foucault calls a judicial society. The more you generalize the enterprise form, the more dynamic the economic subject becomes. Enterprises are inherently competitive. They multiply the surfaces of friction, disagreement, and conflict.
So more competition means more lawsuits.
It means a massive increase in the need for judicial intervention, arbitration, litigation, and regulatory enforcement of the rules of the competitive game.
This sets the stage for the second major shift Foucault analyzes, which is the American neoliberalism of the Chicago School. This takes the restructuring of the subject even further, transforming Homo economicus as a governing subject.
The American model, championed by thinkers like Gary Becker and Milton Friedman, it pushes Homo economicus far beyond the classical liberal definition. The classical subject was a simple exchange partner, someone who enters into contracts. The neoliberal subject is radically different.
And this is where we get the phrase the entrepreneur of himself.
That's the one. It's one of the most provocative ideas in the lectures. And what it means in practice is that every single aspect of an individual's life, their skills, their health, their relationships, is analyzed through the lens of capital and investment.
So the worker isn't just a worker anymore.
The worker is analyzed not just in terms of labor time, but as a kind of machine-possessing human capital, both innate capital, like talent or genes, and acquired capital, like education and training.
So the wage isn't payment for a day's work. It's the return on that capital.
Precisely. The wage is simply the earning stream generated by optimizing that human capital. And as a consequence, the individual is seen as being continuously engaged in investment decisions.
So my decision to go to college isn't just about learning.
In the eyes of this system, it's a capital investment designed to maximize the earning stream produced by your human machine. Residential choices, health choices, even your diet all become continuous investment decisions to maximize your own capital and your competitive position in the market.
It's genuinely shocking to hear this kind of calculation applied to domains we traditionally think of as, well, purely social or moral.
And this is where American neoliberalism is truly radical. It extends this economic logic to traditionally non-economic domains. Take the analysis of crime.
Okay.
It's completely stripped of its psychological or moral context and analyzed as a rational economic choice. The criminal weighs the anticipated benefit, the loot from the crime against the anticipated cost, which is the risk and severity of punishment. Good penal policy, therefore, just aims to adjust the cost side of that ledger to manage the overall supply of crime.
So it's not about rehabilitation.
Not primarily, it's about disincentivizing. And it even extends to relationships. Marriage is viewed as a contract that reduces the transaction costs associated with complex, repeated exchanges. Even your genetics or your family background are viewed as forms of innate human capital.
So all of life becomes a series of strategic economic choices.
Every part of it. And this intense level of economic activity creates the need for these feedback loops between economy, law, and governance. If the state is limited, the law has to step in and do more work.
Right, and thinkers like Hayek argued that the law has to be strictly formal. What did he mean by that?
He meant fixed, general rules that apply to everyone, and crucially, a legal system that must never pursue a particular end or a target outcome. It has to reject central planning because planning aims for specific, predetermined results.
So the government sets the rules of the competitive game, but can never try to pick the winners or influence the final score.
Correct. But if administrative intervention recedes, meaning the state steps back from setting prices or issuing explicit commands, then all these dynamic enterprises, which are the true economic subjects, they multiply the need for legal enforcement and arbitration.
So as administrative power goes down, judicial power goes up.
Exactly. Justice tends to become an omnipresent public service. The rule of law becomes intrinsically linked to maintaining this necessary and fundamentally artificial competitive environment. The law isn't just there to protect individual rights. It's there to protect the integrity of the competitive mechanism itself.
Given all this complexity, this constant management, how does Foucault suggest this system even persists? Especially since it requires so much active work to maintain the very freedom it claims to champion.
The system persists precisely because competition is not a natural state of being. It's an objective that has to be artificially produced and maintained by the government's constant intervention, what the ordoliberals called framework policy.
So freedom isn't just a given.
Freedom, in this context, is not a static right. It is an actual relation that is continuously managed and arbitrated. The state has to constantly intervene through security mechanisms, surveillance, financial regulation, to ensure the mechanism of interest doesn't create collective dangers like a stock market crash or social unrest that would undermine the entire competitive order. The system persists because it is constantly being made to persist.
Foucault was analyzing this shift during the late 1970s, which really gives his analysis a powerful, predictive, and explanatory force for everything that followed. Let's connect his concepts to contemporary neoliberal governance today.
Well, the 1970s marked a true global crisis point. The post-war Keynesian model, based on state management, full employment, was collapsing under the weight of inflation, rising unemployment,
Right.
stagflation.
Right.
And this catalyzed a systematic global shift. You saw countries like France, England, and the United States begin to liquidate those core post-war objectives. They were actively choosing to abandon the goal of full employment.
And instead, they pivoted toward the ordoliberal ideal.
They did, prioritizing price stability, controlling inflation, and aggressively promoting market integration. They were essentially trying to catch up with the proven success of the German model. And politically, this move was framed as the only solution. Interventionist state policies were now cast as the cause of the crisis, which created a strong push to liberalize.
And this new philosophy had a direct effect on social policy, didn't it? It led to entirely new structures based on this market-based policy logic. The French proposal of a negative tax is a really striking example.
The negative tax, which was championed by figures like Lionel Stolaroux in France, but also Milton Friedman in the US, it perfectly exemplifies this new logic applied to social welfare. The policy targets absolute poverty, it guarantees a vital minimum for survival, but it explicitly refuses to target relative poverty or equality.
Because those are seen as anti-economic.
Exactly. They're viewed as counterproductive to market dynamics. The mechanism is carefully designed to guarantee a base level of consumption, but to maintain a necessary level of frustration or motivation.
So you give people enough to survive, but not enough to be comfortable.
Precisely. The income guarantee is deliberately set low enough, or tapered off sharply enough, so that the assisted population remains actively available for work, even low-wage work. It creates a kind of floating liminal labor population that's assisted in a very streamlined, non-bureaucratic way that minimizes disciplinary oversight compared to old welfare systems.
So it's a shift from collective social insurance to individualized assistance managed by economic incentives.
That's it exactly. And this necessity of creating and managing competition really highlights the role of regulatory states and managerial power. It just disproves the simple idea that neoliberalism means zero government.
It means a very active government, but active in a specific way.
Right, it's focused on framework policy, not targeted control. Foucault points to Euchen's model for German agriculture, which was a blueprint for the common agricultural market. The government didn't intervene on farm prices or production output. That was the old way.
So what do they organize instead?
They engaged in active organizing actions that manipulated the conditions for competition. They regulated the size of the agricultural population, they set limits on farm sizes, they encouraged new technology. This managerial power aims to actively create the competitive order because the ordoliberals, unlike classical liberals, did not believe competition just happened spontaneously.
They believed the state had to work hard to make the market possible.
To make it possible as the general regulator of society.
And finally, let's revisit how this hyper-rationality plays out in the American context, especially with the penal system and this concept of security, liberty, and economic rationality.
In American neoliberalism, the overarching critique of any government action operates as a permanent economic tribunal. Every public action, from environmental regulation to traffic management, is scrutinized for contradiction, inconsistency, and its overall cost when measured against market efficiency. It's a tool for discriminating against any kind of administrative excess.
And the penal system is the most chilling example of applying this homo economicus logic universally.
It is. The criminal act is fully rationalized. The penal system is no longer primarily concerned with moral rehabilitation or achieving perfect justice. It's an economic mechanism.
How so?
Because crime is viewed as a rational choice, good penal policy must aim not for the extinction of crime, which would be prohibitively expensive, but for a calculated balance between the supply of crime and society's negative demand for it.
So crime becomes a manageable cost of doing business in a free society.
That's the view. As long as the system can keep the balance favorable, a certain level of crime is an acceptable and calculable risk.
In other words, society tolerates an optimized level of criminality because reducing it further would require state intervention and thus cost that is deemed inefficient or anti-economic.
That's the logical conclusion of treating all human behavior, even criminal behavior, as a calculated utility function.
When we pulled all of Foucault's insights together, they align so perfectly with our ongoing mission here at Crisis and Perception, which is to understand how systems, rather than just individuals, determine outcomes.
First, Foucault demonstrates that power fundamentally shifts. Power is exercised through norms rather than explicit force. The system relies on continuous arbitration and supervision, these sophisticated security mechanisms that respond to calculated dangers and manage risk, rather than the explicit command of a sovereign. It governs by defining the rules of the game.
Which makes the structure of power very diffuse and procedural.
Exactly. And it also gives us a clear window into how truth is produced by institutions. His idea of a regime of veridiction.
Right.
We learn that politics and economy aren't these fixed natural things out there in the world. They are, as he puts it, non-existent things that are nonetheless imperiously marked out in reality by the coupling of specific practices, like free exchange, with these necessary regimes of truth. The market, as the site of veridiction, makes economic reality the inescapable standard for everything.
Which means that freedom itself is not a static right. It's a managed input into the system. Freedom is governed through incentives.
Yes, freedom is defined as an actual relation between governors and governed. It is continuously produced by these apparatuses of security and managed through incentives. The state needs homo economicus to be free because only a free individual can continuously calculate and invest their capital to maximize utility.
So intervention is designed to generate the optimal amount of freedom needed for the economy to work. Liberty becomes a carefully maintained input, not a guaranteed output.
Well said. And finally, looking at systems versus individual agency, Foucault shows how this governmental rationality structures the very subject of modern society.
It creates the template for who we are supposed to be.
It does. The key shift is the transition from homo juridicus, the historical subject of law and rights, defined by contract, to homo economicus, the subject of interest, defined by the continuous imperative to maximize utility. The system creates the template for our identity, restructuring the individual as a calculating agent, an entrepreneur of their own existence, whose identity is intrinsically linked to maximizing their human capital.
This deep dive into the birth of biopolitics fundamentally rewrites how we should understand the modern relationship between the state, the market, and the individual. Foucault helps us see that modern governance is characterized by the internal economic rationalization of how we are governed, not by the state maximizing its sovereign control from on high.
It's a system that's driven by an imperative of maximum economy in the exercise of power. It's about achieving the greatest effect, collective wealth, stability, with the least amount of explicit coercion and resources. And this means the system has to start from society and its complex interplay of interests, not from the transcendental historical existence of the state itself.
So the increasing primacy of economics means that the legitimacy and the operational logic of the state are now determined by its economic root, rather than, say, a singular historical will or some grand ideological ideal.
And government is forced to model its own behavior on the rational behavior of the people it governs on, the maximizing behavior of homo economicus. It operates by manipulating the framework within which we all make what are defined as rational economic choices.
We're left, then, with a profound and perhaps pretty unsettling open question to consider. What are the consequences for individual autonomy when the very definition of the subject, our identity, our relationships, our choices, is so thoroughly restructured as a calculation of capital and a constant engagement in strategic economic optimization, even in non-market domains?
And perhaps even more critically for political debate today, when political critique is increasingly reduced to measuring efficiency and cost against these economic market metrics, when the only question we ask about a government action is this the most efficient way to use resources? What power remains for appeals based on traditional rights or justice or any other non-economic ethical values?
We have been dissecting the profound and difficult ideas laid out by Michel Foucault in The Birth of Biopolitics. If these concepts resonated with you and you want to understand these systems further, we encourage you to read the book yourself. Please support the author if you found these ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoyed this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.